So I work for a think tank called Demos. And demos, which I did not know until I started working there, is the Greek word for the people of a nation, and it's the root word of democracy. And at my organization, we see the issue of democracy as a really multifaceted one, in which you can look at the inequalities in our democracy and see how they play out and create inequalities in our economy. And so the main issues that I work on are issues of economic policy and democracy reform. And since I joined Demos nearly 8 years ago, we've started working on a different lens to talk about these issues than they are normally talked about in Washington and in the media, which is a generational lens. I am at the leading edge of the Millennial Generation. I'm pretty much the oldest millennial you can have right now, but I'm gonna keep claiming it until somebody kicks me out. And so we have been issuing these reports for the past 5 years called The State of Young America. And I know that some of you have some copies, and they're available at stateofyoungamerica.org or on the Demos website. And it's allowed me to bring this story about our economy and about our democracy to some wonderful rooms, particularly of young people, of high school students and college students, community centers. And one of the first things that I feel like is important for me to sort of set out whenever I'm talking to broad audiences is sort of reimagine the basic metaphor we usually use to think about the economy. Typically speaking, when we all talk about the economy, we call to mind something that's sort of like the weather, right? We get economic news like weather reports every day on our drive time about the stock market going up and down, like the temperature, or the new unemployment figures, like a sort of storm alert. And it makes it feel like the economy is a bunch of unseen, uncontrollable forces that are dictating the way the wind will blow economically in our lives. And that's just not true. The economy is absolutely 100% human-made. So I like to replace that metaphor with a different one. The economy is not the weather. In fact, it's more like a massive multiplayer game, right? This plays really well in high school. Right, they sort of perk up in the bleachers, right? Where the most powerful gamers, whether it's business executives or government officials, are constantly tweaking the rules of the game, and it makes it easier or harder with every tweak for some players and some teams to get ahead and score points. And just like in a game, individual talent and determination and drive matter in the economy, right? Of course they do. That's what we all tell our children. It's what we tell ourselves every day when we wake up and suit up for work. But fundamentally, the rules of the game are guiding the outcome. And also, like in a game, it often matters most what team you start out on, how successful you can be. So I'm constantly challenging myself in our work to think about the rules that enable people to succeed or fail, or to feel like they're running and running but not getting ahead. And I first started getting into this work actually because I was asking myself questions about the economy that didn't seem like they could be answered by just thinking about individual effort and skill, which was the story that I knew growing up about the economy and why people succeed. Like, why is it that when everybody tells us that college is so important, our tuition and fees so expensive, and in fact out of reach for so many Americans? Particularly in my generation, when it didn't used to be that way for my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation. Why are there so many jobs, and not easy jobs either, back-breaking, exhausting jobs, where someone can work all day and night and still not be able to afford both rent and groceries without going into debt? Why is it a given that most Americans will struggle financially when a family member gets sick or when they have a child, when we're supposed to be a society with family values? Now, there was a time in recent American history when the rules of this economic game were very different, and there were a lot more winners. It was a time when a certain belief system that animated our economic policies helped create the greatest middle class the world has ever known. There was a 30-year period between the end of World War II and the late 1970s when tens of millions of Americans reached an unprecedented level of financial security and freedom. Many were the children of European immigrants or African Americans who had migrated internally from the South to cities like Chicago, like my grandparents did. And during this period of time, one man with a high school diploma and a unionized factory job was able to support his wife and children, buy a home, have health care and guaranteed retirement coverage and a pension to look forward to, and even save for the future. If he wanted to go to college, he could with a free government grant with no debt. And the CEO of the company that man probably worked for would have paid himself, on average, across the economy, about 25 times what he paid his average worker. In that post-war period between the late 1940s and the late 1970s, in fact, until basically about the time that I was born in 1980, the government collected far more in taxes and far more from those who could afford it, the wealthy and corporations, and reinvested that money in America's people and in our future, creating the national highway system, funding government research that would lead to trillions of dollars in inventions that the private sector would develop and market and profit from, enacting the GI Bill that put a generation to college on grants, not loans, and making home ownership broadly affordable for the first time in American history, and not just on an exploding teaser rate. But that was then, and that's not the picture today. As we all know, today it typically takes both parents working to have that kind of security. It takes college degrees paid for on loans mostly, not grants. And even still, most families have expensive, uncertain health insurance and a retirement account that they have to fund out of their own paychecks that could disappear with a bad quarter on the stock market. And the typical CEO pays himself nearly 200 times more than he pays his average worker. If you look at the features of the economy in the post-war period compared to my lifetime, unfortunately, it really can be crystallized into one figure that when I don't have a PowerPoint, I actually use my hand to look at the income growth among American families. And if you slice the income sort of ladder up in 5 parts, and you can have sort of each one of my fingers be one of those quintiles. In the post-war period, all American families saw their income grow on average, about 2% a year, and in fact, the lowest income families saw their incomes grow faster than everybody else. That changed radically around 1979, 1980. And we've seen the picture of income growth where it's been, the vast majority of the growth has just gone to the top, most well-compensated workers and their families. So here's a slide from the Economic Policy Institute, a wonderful sister organization. And the blue bars are representing the income growth between that in that first post-war period. So you see the highest bar belongs actually to the furthest left, the bottom fifth of the income distribution. If you switch to this period of time over the past 30 so years, you see that the lowest income families actually saw a year-over-year decline in their incomes. The second fifth barely budged. These are all adjusted for inflation. See how much slower the growth is in general for everybody during this period of inequality, and that the highest gains did go to the families that were the best paid. CEO pay is obviously something that seems to sort of crystallize a sense of people who work in the same enterprise together and are paid radically different sums for their labor. This is basically just showing that around 25 times the average worker CEO pay earlier, and then today, it's actually, I can get an updated slide if I do a little bit of crunching myself, because it's shot back up again. This ends in 2009, where it precipitously declined a little bit, obviously, because of the financial crisis and the stock market losses, but it's back up to actually over the peak today. And one other way to visualize the change that has happened has been to look at the way wages and productivity tracked in this post-war period. So on the far end, we have from 1948, the light blue line is hourly compensation for workers, and the dark blue line is productivity. And it was essentially those who were doing the work and making more efficient and making efficiency gains saw that those efficiency gains come back to them in terms of hourly wages. And there was a massive break, again, right around that time in the late 1970s. And so that productivity continues to go up. We continue to make more for our work and our effort, and yet compensation has essentially stagnated. Today in our economy, about 1 out of every 3 jobs is a low-wage job with little to no benefits, where a worker is working at around $20,000, $25,000 a year and typically can't keep his or her family out of poverty at that level. So what happened in this period of time, other than most millennials started to be born? I swear it's not my personal fault, but I have sort of dedicated my career to trying to figure it out and change it. So what happened to our economy to change this picture so much? Now, a lot of people will say it was the march of progress, right? It was globalization, it was technological change, it was the information age, and it's true. Those changes did occur, and they brought new competition from other countries and a new premium on higher education. But our politics changed, and our public values changed as well. Shifted the bedrock of beliefs that people, particularly people in power, had about the fundamental answer to the question, what is our economy for? Because if the economy is a game where you are always setting the rules, then what is the purpose of the game? And therefore, what principles guide the way that we change the rules? Back in 1963, Bobby Kennedy summed it up this way. He said, and I'm not going to do my Massachusetts accent, although I went to high school there. I could, but I'm not going to do it. It is the essence of responsibility to put the public good ahead of private gain. That was 1963, Bobby Kennedy. Fast forward to 1982, when President Ronald Reagan boasted about wanting, quote, to see an America in which people can still get rich. And he wasn't alone. Leaders and economists in both parties began to believe that the best way for everyone to succeed was if the rules were written to ensure the greatest possible accumulation of wealth at the top and the biggest profits at particularly the biggest businesses and corporations, and then the money would trickle down to the rest of America. So if that's the guiding belief about the way that the rules of the game should be ordered, what were the rules that changed? I'll give a few examples. So since it's easier for some people, particularly stock market investors and executives at a company, to get wealthy if corporate profits are high because the cost of doing business, particularly the cost of hiring workers, is low, organized business began lobbying in the 1970s. The Chamber of Commerce, which is the nation's largest lobbying organization, has spent over $1 billion lobbying just over the past 10 years since they were required to disclose. One of their main targets is to keep the minimum wage low. The minimum wage has lost nearly half of its purchasing power since 1968. The rules of the economic game were also changed to make it easier for businesses to ship jobs to places with cheaper, more easily exploitable workers, to avoid paying taxes, to influence our elected leaders. Much more on that in a second. And a major reason why these decisions keep being made that so clearly make average working people worse off is that the rules have changed to make it easier for businesses to resist what used to be a protected right that people died for in this country, which is the ability to form a union. And that has meant that the voice of people who simply work for a living has been quieter and quieter at the businesses they work for, at our leading corporations, like the fiercely anti-union poverty wage employer, which is our biggest employer in this country, Walmart. It replaced GM. GM, a company that helped build the middle class, to become our leading employer. And that voice of people who work for a living has also been silenced in the halls of power, where unions are often the lone voice lobbying for people who depend on paychecks. And one of the most dramatic rule changes was the one that shifted responsibility for paying taxes to keep our country going, from corporations and the already wealthy further on to individuals of more modest means. Just since 1980, the top tax rate on money that comes from stocks and bonds and assets and investment has fallen by half, while it's gone up on middle-class paychecks by 8%. That is how today, as you may have heard during the recent election, Mitt Romney, the Buffett rule, an investor can pay a lower tax rate on the money that his or her money makes in the stock market than his nanny or janitor can pay on their work. Back in 1955, corporations actually used to contribute nearly 30% of the federal taxes that we collected. Today, it's just 9%, and dozens of our leading successful US businesses actually spend more on lobbying and on bonuses for their CEOs than they do contributing to their country every year in taxes. And while all these rules have changed to make it harder for most working families to get ahead and easier for a small sliver of us to amass and to keep really an unprecedented amount of wealth in our history, the rules did not change to keep up with the changing times in ways that would have given more families a leg up, like responding to the premium on education with more college grants, not shifting to loans, or responding to the necessity of both parents working by giving financial help for childcare or paid family leave like nearly every other industrial nation has, or by providing universal health care. We're a little bit closer there. By providing portable pensions. If we know that people are going to change jobs, they're not going to stay at the same job for their whole life, why can't we have portable pensions? Or a more generous unemployment insurance system in the era of easy layoffs and downsizing. And now I want to talk a little bit about the way all of these changes have come to bear on our generation. As I keep saying, things really began to change in the late 1970s and 80s in a way that has resulted in all of these economic policy changes fundamentally changing the rules of the game for when my generation comes into adulthood and tries to start our lives. Oops. So, the Millennial Generation. When we do our report, The State of Young America, we look at people 18 to 34. And we compare millennials to their parents, the baby boomers, who were similarly aged in 1980. So what we have seen is that compared to our parents, the millennial generation is actually the first in American history to not be better off economically than their parents. That is the American dream summed up, that your children will do better than you. And we have dimmed the lights on that dream for this generation so far. So this slide shows it broken out by gender because it's very important, because for the most, that's one of the big stories, obviously, of the transition of the last 40 years, is how much more women have worked and seen income gains. So as a whole, for all educational levels, men in 1980 were making about $42,000 a year. This is all adjusted for inflation. And it's dropped by about 10 cents on the dollar into 2010. Women were making a lot less on average. Many women were not, in fact, working in 1980 at this age group because this was the age of having their first child. And they're making more than they did then as a whole, about 17% more, which is great. It should be, considering so many more women are working. The majority of women at this age are now working. But as you see, even still, even at $34,000, that's still a heck of a lot less than the man was making in 1980. The gender to wage ratio has narrowed very much for our generation, which is a success story, but we still know that fundamentally it's taking two parents working, which is creating a lot higher costs and allowing young families particularly to have a little less economic security than their parents did. The story really changed around education, right? We've become a nation where we have to educate ourselves to compete, where that high school diploma is not enough to have a middle-class job. And you can see this. So this is the typical earnings right at the middle point, the median, for workers in age 25 to 34 who have a bachelor's degree or higher. And among women, it's really skyrocketed. Among men, it did increase, but you'll see actually over the past decade, those gains have been eroded. If you look at young people who just have a high school diploma, it's been a pretty phenomenal decrease in their average wages when they come out and start into the workforce. And so the question is, if there is this big premium on a bachelor's degree, shouldn't we as a country say, if we want this country to be a middle-class nation with lots of economic security and broadly shared prosperity, shouldn't we invest a lot more in higher education, make it a lot easier for people to afford it, given how important it is? And unfortunately, just at the time when the goalposts changed for what was required to have a middle-class life, we sort of start to gild those goalposts. Over the past 30 years, tuition adjusted for inflation and fees at public schools has nearly tripled. A big part of that story, I'll talk about in a minute, is the fact that we've shifted the way we fund in-state and public colleges. But on the back end, in terms of how most people are paying for it, in my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation, the grants, the federal grants that you got used to pay for the majority of your college tuition and fees. If you look from 1980 to 1981, the Pell Grant, which is the grant for the lowest income families, used to cover 2 out of every $3 of tuition and fees, of your typical tuition and fees. Now it's just a little over 1 out of every 3. So we're making it up in loans. And the Pell Grants are only available to a very small number of Americans. One of the things that we wanted to do at Demos was really try to answer a bit more of this question of why it is that college tuition keeps increasing year after year. And so we looked at how colleges are funded. And the majority of how they were funded a generation ago was through public dollars at the state level. Since 1990, just 20 years ago, we wanted to make it even sort of a narrower time band to show that it really wasn't sort of an entirely different era. But just since 1990, the amount that states pay of the state revenue and tax dollars to their in-state college systems has declined per student by about 26%. This is at a time when that college degree has become so much more important to our economy, to our global competitiveness, and obviously just to individual people. If you look at another way of sort of describing that decrease, you can look at it in terms of per $1,000 in income. Because in fact, over this period of time, personal income has grown 66%, right? Particularly because of the gains at the top. And in 1990, about $8.75 for every $1,000 of income in a state were paid into the public college system. And that's down, even though we have essentially more money in states in terms of personal income that we could be using to fund what used to be a public good and has now really become a private cost. So now that I've depressed you completely, you may be asking, how is it that life has gotten harder financially for the vast majority of Americans over the past 40 years, but these rules keep getting changed in this detrimental way, and that our political conversation is not usually about this level of rule change? And that's where at Demos we really believe that what's happened is our democracy has become as unequal as our economy. Over the course of my lifetime, an entire new industry has appeared. I guess it does create jobs, so maybe that's good. That of corporate lobbyists, for which there are now 24 for every member of Congress. The legalized bribery that is big money campaign contributions has increased by over 600% just since I turned 18 to over $2 billion a year, and that was before this record presidential and congressional cycle. Members of Congress, accordingly, because of the funding arms race, now spend 1 out of every 3 minutes that they are in office fundraising. So what does that mean? It means not only that 1 out of every 3 minutes of the time that we are spending for them to attend to our public needs, they're spending attending to their own, but it also means that they are spending that time in conversation with the very wealthiest in our country. We are not a country in which average Americans are, bundling together thousands of dollars of their neighbors and taking it to Washington and going to these fundraisers. We are a country in which the amount of money that you have, we are a country in which the amount of money that you can contribute financially to campaigns is far skewed, so that the majority of campaign contributions are coming from the top 1% of Americans who have different policy prescriptions and interests than the vast majority of Americans. We can look at just one issue, which is the question that's going to be on everyone's minds for the next few months, which is the question of, should we be reducing the deficit and cutting spending, or should we be investing in job creation now? If you look at the way that Americans' opinions fall off on that in terms of income, 2 to 1 Americans of average means think that we should wait to cut the deficit, particularly because it will create job losses in the short term, and be focused on relieving unemployment. But 2 to 1 Americans of wealth think that we should be paying attention to the deficit and not unemployment. And look what we are going to be doing for the next 6 months. Princeton political scientist Larry Bartels has actually found that, quote, the preferences of people at the bottom third of the income distribution appear to have no apparent impact on the behavior of their elected officials. None. So obviously this part of this unequal political voice, given how much the decisions in Washington and our state houses shape opportunity for all of us, is a huge part of the story of what has happened over the last 40 years as campaign finance rules have been chipped away by an activist court. But something else happened in our culture. And this is when I ask myself, why did it somehow become publicly acceptable to evade taxes as if companies and individuals owe nothing to their neighbors or to the country that they live in? Why did it become completely okay to assert that any kind of public help, from healthcare to unemployment insurance, is sort of unfair redistribution from worthy job creators to undeserving freeloaders? Why did it become publicly okay to sort of demonize the class of people who in different eras was known as the little guy that you root for? And this, I believe, is where the increasingly unexamined role of unconscious bias comes into our public culture in ways that are eroding opportunity for all of us. Since the end of the civil rights era, we have had a deep and growing anxiety in this country about who is an American. It's that anxiety that is allowing, I believe, these more selfish values to take root, even among people who are suffering economically under the new economic rules. And why do I say since the end of the civil rights era? And because it seems counterintuitive. But 2 things happened at once in the mid-1960s. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 finally decreed that the law could not segregate or discriminate based on skin color, which upset the social order. And the Immigration Act of 1965 liberalized our immigration laws. Now, did you know that until 1965, the United States actually had racial limits on who could legally immigrate into the country? There was a strict limit on the number of Asians and Africans, for example, and even a limit on Southern and Eastern Europeans who were considered ethnic. Northern European countries had no limit. Think about that. Think about how that shaped opportunity for people. And so when that finally changed in 1965 as part of the civil rights era, the next 40 plus years saw an amazing transformation in the physical appearance of the people in this country who are Americans. And that really all began, that great diversification of the American people shot up after the civil rights movement ended. So why does this new diversity matter to Americans' feelings about public solutions to common problems, about economic fairness and taxes and jobs? Is it because we're all racist? No, not quite. But not no at all either. Because the human brain naturally puts objects and people and ideas into categories. It's actually part of our great intelligence. And it naturally takes shortcuts to do these categorizations. You know, that red round thing on the table is an apple, and apples are apples, Fiji, Macintosh or not, and that orange round thing on the table is an orange, and oranges are oranges, mandarin or navel or not, and apples are sweet, and oranges are tart, and we learn that very early on to collapse things into categories. And so our brain also categorizes people by their physical characteristics as well. And to go beyond that, it finds mental shortcuts to give meaningful attributes to those categories. And the problem is that most of these shortcuts and meanings are going on subconsciously without our conscious awareness all the time. Unfortunately, in our society, because we've been so hierarchical along these lines of physical appearance, of race, of gender, of age, that the shortcuts that we are constantly primed to be making when we see people with different physical characteristics have unequal consequences. So there's this study of implicit bias out of Harvard University where you can go online, implicitbias.net, I think, and you are asked to quickly, on your computer, take a test where you're asked to quickly associate with mouse clicks words with faces. And the studies that they've shown, millions of people have taken this test, reveal that we are nearly universally less able to quickly associate darker faces with positive words. Nearly universally. That means people of color as well, though white respondents do have a longer lag time, do find it more difficult than non-whites to associate darker faces with lighter words. Same things with more positive words. Same thing happens when you look at gender. And all that is to say that prejudices and stereotyping are normal. They're actually hardwired into our brains. In this country, racial hierarchy is like the oxygen that we breathe. It is part of our society. But we have to develop a better sort of metabolism for processing it, for checking our unconscious biases and anxieties. And that doesn't make it acceptable, but it does make it understandable. And it certainly means that we can't keep pretending that it's not a part of our society. America is the great multiracial, multi-ethnic experiment in democracy. We should be proud of this. No other wealthy country tries to take a democracy out of a room that looks like this and say that you all get an equal say no matter where your ancestors came from. We must take that as a point of our exceptionalism. That is what makes us a city on a hill. And we have to acknowledge the challenges that come with that and take a good bit of American pride at working at it every day. And not, as we have, particularly since the end of the civil rights era, sweep it under the rug and pretend like we can all be colorblind. Because if we don't acknowledge the racial hierarchy and biases that are still with us, our entire society will continue to fall victim to the inequalities, to the instability, to the insecurity that comes when people don't feel like they're all in it together, when some people are allowed to, frankly, just be in it for themselves. You know, at the end of the last era of public acknowledgement of the challenge of living in a multiracial democracy, Dr. King knew that economic justice and racial justice were entwined. He actually called the state of sort of true economic justice the Brotherhood of man. Now, I work in economic policy. I've been at tables with the president's leading economic advisors, and I've debated solutions to the country's job crisis on Capitol Hill, and never, not once, have I heard someone refer to the goal of economic policy as attaining the brotherhood of man. So I have to ask myself, what would the brotherhood of man look like in economic policy? I think it would look like people being proud to pay taxes, because that's paying back the investment that the country made in your success through roads and schools and public utilities and defense and public research. and feeling like you need to help provide for our common future, even though you may not recognize what the future looks like. And I think it would look like government and business and philanthropists working together to ensure that the basics of life, a great education, a roof over your head, a way to care for your children or yourself when you feel sick, an old age with dignity, they would ensure that these things are not actually out of reach for most Americans as they are now, but they are the minimum that we can guarantee for us all. I think that this would be enabled by a democracy in which everyone who is eligible to vote can vote, and we cut the red tape that we have surrounding our voting process and make it a lot easier for people to exercise their freedom to vote, and where the elections, where we decide who represents our will, are not funded by a small sliver of our economic distribution, where we have public funding of elections. And I think that even outside of the realm of government policy and politics, I think that it would look like the CEOs of American companies seeing their job not just to create goods and services and profits for themselves and their shareholders, but to create good jobs, decent jobs, jobs with dignity for their fellow human beings. Because when we say that the CEO of Walmart, for example, is worth $10,000 an hour, whereas his coworker is worth $7 an hour on the floor of the stores, or pennies an hour in the factory in India or Malaysia where the product on the shelves is actually made, what does that mean? When you see two models of phone in the store and one costs $30 and one costs $300, what do you decide about the more expensive one? That it's better. And it's so easy to apply that same logic to human beings. And it's so wrong. Our generation is the generation that is going to fulfill the promise that was set out when we made this experiment called America. We have continued to be a country where we're perfecting the idea that people who look different ways, speak different language, listen to different music, eat different foods, never see each other because they don't leave their state or county, are all actually citizens in one common project. Because our generation is the most diverse generation in American history. Nearly half of children under 18 are children of color. You know, when Dr. King in 1963 spoke of the little black children and the little white children side by side, even he could never have predicted how much our generation would come to embody that vision, plus brown and yellow and red children. But fundamentally, the fact that we have come of age in an economy that has proven the failure of a social order that doesn't recognize our common humanity has actually led to a radicalization and a backlash among our generation. Fortunately for the future, our generation, having grown up hearing that you're all on your own, has decided that in fact, no, we're in this together. According to public polling, more than any other generation since the Depression era generation, the first greatest generation, but I promise you not the last, we believe in sacrificing, individuals sacrificing for the common good, not just seeking out our own private gain at all costs. I believe that it'll be our generation that will finally achieve a sustainable, fair economy where everyone, regardless of what zip code or school district they were born into, can meet their basic needs and have a shot at fulfilling their dreams. There is a relative privilege that all of us in this room have compared to the vast majority of Americans. That relative privilege is not a reason to avoid questions of economic inequality, not at all. Our relative privilege is an opportunity, for it gives us power. And what is power but the ability to make change? We have just come through an election in which these questions of what kind of country we want to be, what our future looks like, what we owe to one another, what makes America an exceptional, great society, and what are the fault lines that are threatening its future, has been at the center. And although it was an exhausting and bruising and ugly and mind-numbing election, I'm really glad that we had that debate. Because for too long, these trends have been going unabated, undiscussed. Inequality has been surging, and most people have only looked to questions of individual effort and skill, and have not been called by their leaders to connect the dots, to see what the rules are that make the game easier for some players or some teams to get ahead. In a democracy, it is supposed to be the people of the nation that write those rules. That's the promise of this great democracy that we have. I think that first of all, we're gonna have to change the rules of our democracy around voting and campaign finance in order to really fulfill that promise of having that much say, people of regular means, over the rules that shape our opportunity. But that's within reach. We can do that. Broad majorities, unbelievable bipartisan majorities of Americans, Tea Party members, libertarians, conservatives, liberals, socialists, hate the way our democracy is functioning today. It is actually the thing that gets citizens united, is how messed up our political system is today. There is a broad mandate for change. That is, I believe, the first step, but it's not the last step. Because even once we make our democracy more representative, we don't want it to just be a numbers game, something where majorities are able to get out of the political system gains for themselves and their group. We have to finally recognize that this country is not like any other wealthy, developed nation, and that it is not easy to find fraternity and sisterhood with someone who doesn't look like you. It's not easy. It's not the way our brains are hardwired. It's certainly not what history has shown, and it's not what our economy and our public debate are asking us to do anymore. But we, as the most multiracial, multi-ethnic generation, have started a conversation, have started to call the question, and I am so very hopeful that as we grow into our political power, as we grow into and through one of the toughest economies this country has ever seen, that we continue to band together and demand more from one another, from our parents and our grandparents, and from our elected officials to really become the kind of country that we can all be proud of. So thank you. I am going to now, thank you. So we have time, plenty of time for questions, which is my favorite part. So, all right, somebody, okay, I'm gonna put my
Real quick, we do have 2 microphones and we're video recording, so if you can, please come up. You can make lines at either of these microphones, and we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your remarks and the reports that you've distributed. They're very helpful.
Okay.
My name is Tom Tresser. I'm working for something called the Civic Lab, a space for civic innovation. So this is the 3rd Humanities Festival event that I've been to where there's an expert on civics that have totally depressed me. And so you use the word power. So I would like to challenge you to help us to achieve power, to get to the place where you want us to be, which I totally agree with. So I challenge you to run for Congress in 2014, and I will give you $100 or pledge $100 and challenge everybody in this room to put $100 in a hat and get you to put these great ideas into public life, because otherwise we're just fooling ourselves. We'll be here at these conferences till we die. We need to put people like you in power. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's really kind. I will take it under advisement. Yes.
She's next.
Oh,
No,
sorry.
I'm next.
Hi.
It's one of the problems is that we got to get a large percentage of the 1% who are super wealthy back into societal involvement again. It seemed like they rejected the American experiment, or they're withdrawing from the American experiment.
That's a really good question. There have been a lot of recent articles and studies about this, about sort of the difference between, and it actually was really sort of nicely crystallized in sort of George Romney, sort of as someone who was an executive who ate in the same lunchroom as his workers and who sacrificed a lot, actually personally and politically, to address racial inequality in Detroit, and how different someone who's of his same level of wealth feels, and sort of the social proximity and the social distance has really changed. I think that's a really good point.
Because some have renounced their citizenship because they don't want to pay taxes in this country.
It's a challenge. It is a challenge for us to figure out how to sort of evoke a sense of patriotism among people who have sort of everything without the public, without kind of the rest of us. But there are many, many patriotic millionaires. There are many, many people who want to pay more in taxes and who want to contribute more to the commons. So thank you for your question.
Yes, you talked a little bit earlier in your presentation about the declining, or at least by inference, the declining power of unions. And it seems to me that I don't see anything that's turning that trend around at all. Quite the opposite. I mean, the kind of the last bastion of any union support is in public employees, and we've seen what happened in Wisconsin and so forth recently. So do you see any reason for, how would you change that? I mean, it just seems to me the deck is stacked so highly against an organization of labor. It's really they're flat on their backs. Yeah,
there is a great article in the American Prospect magazine, which Demos is a sort of partner with. It's a cover story called What Happens If Unions Die, and really just looks at the history of labor and the history of the changes in the rules and the power that can explain why organized labor has gone from covering about 1 out of every 3 workers at its high point in that period to just under 1 out of every 10 today. It is true that, generally speaking, people who care about economic justice and fairness have shifted the focal point of their advocacy to government and to politics, where at a previous time, that advocacy happened on the job. We have kind of, I think, a little bit sort of given up on the idea that, employers would pay more, and that you don't have to go to government to ask them to pay more, although the minimum wage being raised would be helpful, but that there's some kind of bargaining power that you have in your own workplace. And that is because of the decline of unions. And I think that there's fundamentally, we're never going to, as working people, and you see this all across the globe, give up on the desire to band together with our coworkers and assert our rights if we are feeling that we are being abused. So even if the numbers continue to decline for the big industrial and service unions of this century, the desire to have that kind of solidarity is going to continue. It's part of all of our history. And it's just a question of whether or not we rewrite the rules to make it easier and to force more of a sense of a full picture of who contributes to a business's success. Is it just the executives? Is it just the shareholders who just click on click on TD Ameritrade, or is it the people who go to work every day? So I think though the rules and the laws and the decline is very dispiriting, I think we are always going to have the hunger for some sort of way to assert our collective rights in a workplace, and our generation may find a different way, a 21st century form of unionism to accomplish that. Yes, thank you.
In the 1960s and 70s, the term poverty was part of our national dialogue, and it hasn't been mentioned in many years. Also at that time, there were poor people movements where there were interracial people working for change, and some of the changes they saw it actually happened. Yeah. This year, the only person who mentioned poverty was Paul Ryan. So I wonder what you think about this and whether this can get back into our national dialogue.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. This year, we did a big conference and set of reports and special magazine about marking the 50th anniversary of Michael Harrington's The Other America, which was a time in which the entire country suddenly, through the force of a book, which is sort of amazing to think about now, was forced to see how in a time of great prosperity, in that time period of unbelievable upward mobility for so many Americans, there was an other America. I think what is difficult about poverty since that period of time, if you think about when Bobby Kennedy was able to marshal so much public support when he went to Appalachia for the kinds of public investments in alleviating poverty, particularly rural poverty, the face of poverty was quite different than the face of poverty that is in our public imagination right now. And the achievement of having a minimum standard of living for everyone through welfare reform in the 1960s became the way that the stereotype about those who are on welfare became a weapon against the very idea of addressing poverty in the 1980s. So that when I was growing up, poverty meant black. Black meant all of the negative stereotypes around my skin color. And the public will to address poverty dried up. I think now we are seeing, and meanwhile, none of the sort of story about why it was that the good jobs left the inner city, why it was that our drug laws changed, why it was that our sentencing laws changed, why it was that people were unable to get access to credit. None of those issues that really are about the rules that make it harder for people to escape poverty were part of the conversation. And so I think now what we're seeing is a level of privation among workers, among people who lost their jobs during the Great Recession through no fault of their own, that is expanding, at least among not the political elite, but among everyday folks, the understanding of who can be beset by poverty at any moment. And that means that there is, I think, a pent-up demand for solutions to it. Solutions that are not going to happen if we continue to cut all of our social spending, if we don't try to create more jobs, if we don't just go ahead and do what we do during the New Deal, which was directly create jobs. We have a generation in this country that is vastly under and unemployed, and there is so much public need for infrastructure, for childcare, for beautification of our roads and parks and social services. There is no reason other than political will why, at political will in Washington, I will say, the 65% of Americans would love to see a Works Progress Administration style, big jobs program for the long-term unemployed and for youth. There are so many public solutions that we just need to lift the volume on the voices of everyday Americans to be able to achieve them. So I think this has to be the last question.
Okay. I just wonder if, historically speaking, if you look back at other societies that have reached similar levels of economic inequality or inequality of political influence, if you can point to any of them and say that they've reached a similar point and somehow found their way back without some sort of great external reset button,
Right.
like a war or something.
Right. I won't say Rome, because that's not good. No, actually, we can just look to our history. We can actually look to the first Gilded Age, where inequality, just measured by the sort of typical inequality Gini coefficient, was pretty much exactly what it is today, where we had a great concentration of wealth among who were then known as the robber barons, not job creators, but robber barons. And when we had an incredible degree of privation and agitation for social justice among who at the time was a fascinating mix of new immigrants from all different ethnicities out of Europe and the sort of one generation descendants of slaves, people who had moved up during the Industrial Revolution, an incredible sort of actually quite parallel set of economic and political forces. Our election systems were as bought, if not more, back then. And we were able to emerge from the Great Depression with a number of people-centered movements, populist movements, all across the country at a time when, if you think about it, it was a lot harder to organize people, right? I mean, people did not travel. This all had to happen by pamphlet and in the town square. There was no, online organizing. There was no national media the way there is today. So I'm very hopeful about our ability to come out of this period of time. I'm very hopeful about our ability to create more interracial and ethnic solidarity because of how widespread the economic pain is. I just don't think we can do it without acknowledging that that's the task at hand. So I just want to thank everyone for coming and staying. This has been wonderful for me. Thank you. I wish you a great rest of the Humanities Festival and a great rest of the year. So thank you so much.